The church was never full in the way that a famous man's church would be full. There were no cameras, no reporters, no long line of distinguished colleagues waiting to speak. Trinity Lutheran on Maple Street in Dunmore Crossing, Massachusetts, held perhaps 80 people on a good Sunday, and on the morning they buried Barnaby Pemberton, it held 63. Marguerite counted them without meaning to. It was a habit from 40 years of planning work, the instinct to measure a room before you spoke in it. She sat in the front pew alone. Mortimer and Celestine had taken the second row, leaving a gap between themselves and Marguerite that felt less like courtesy and more like a declaration. Celestine wore a charcoal coat with a fur collar that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Mortimer sat with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set in the particular way of a man performing grief for an audience while feeling something considerably different. Marguerite did not look at them for long. She looked at the casket, at the simple arrangement of white chrysanthemums Barnaby would have chosen himself, and at Pastor Clement Prescott, who stood behind the pulpit with the particular steadiness of a man who had delivered both joy and devastation from that same spot for 25 years, and had learned that the only honest thing to do with either was to meet it directly. Clement was 65 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been kind for so long that kindness had become its permanent architecture. He had known Barnaby Pemberton since they were young men arguing about baseball on the steps of the old town hall, back when Dunmore Crossing was still small enough that you knew everyone's coffee order before you knew their last name. He began with a story, not a scripture, not a formal tribute, a story. He said that 3 years ago, a woman named Ruth Kavanaugh had come to him in distress. She ran a small alteration shop on Birch Avenue and had fallen behind on her lease after a medical emergency. She had nowhere left to turn. Clement said he made some calls, pulled some threads, tried to help in the ways available to a small-town pastor with limited resources. A week later, Ruth's back rent was paid in full, and when she tried to find out who had done it, she was told only that it had been taken care of by a friend of the church. Clement said he found out 2 years later by accident that the friend of the church had been Barnaby Pemberton. He said Barnaby had never mentioned it, not to Clement, not to Ruth directly, not to anyone. He had simply seen a problem that needed solving, solved it, and moved on. That was the thing about Barnaby Pemberton, Clement said. He did not do good things because he wanted to be known for doing them. He did them because the alternative, which was to know about a problem and walk past it, was something he found genuinely incomprehensible. Marguerite sat in the front pew and listened to her husband being described by someone who had known him differently than she had, and she felt a particular ache of discovering new rooms in a house you thought you had memorized. She had known Barnaby for 53 years. She had known his coffee preferences and his sleeping habits and the exact way he held a pen and the sound he made when he was genuinely delighted by something. She had known the outline of him so thoroughly that she had perhaps stopped noticing the details. Clement was giving her the details back one story at a time. He told the room about Barnaby arriving at his office 15 minutes early for every meeting he ever had, not because he was anxious, but because he considered lateness a form of disrespect toward the other person's time. He told them about Barnaby driving 4 hours to a February ice storm to meet with a small manufacturing client who was facing bankruptcy, refusing any payment and staying until midnight, helping them restructure their accounting. He told them about Barnaby writing personal letters by hand to every employee his consulting firm had ever let go, thanking them for their contribution and offering a reference without being asked. None of these things were in Barnaby's obituary. Barnaby had not put them there. Marguerite held her hands together in her lap and breathed steadily through all of it. The discipline of a lifetime had prepared her for public composure, and she would not abandon it here. But inside, in the quiet architecture of her grief, something shifted. She had married this man. She had built a life beside him. And here, in a church on Maple Street, on an October morning, she was learning for the first time the full dimensions of what he had been. The service ended. People filed out in the soft, murmuring way of those who have witnessed something genuine and are not quite sure what to do with it. Mortimer shook hands. Celestine accepted condolences with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a social function. Marguerite stood near the door and received the community's kindness with the simple grace of a woman who had never needed anyone's sympathy and did not know what to do with an excess of it. When the room had mostly emptied, Clement appeared at her elbow. He was holding a small envelope, plain white letter, sized with Marguerite's name, written on the front in Barnaby's handwriting. The handwriting she would have known anywhere, that careful, slightly left-leaning script that had been filling margins and shopping lists and anniversary cards for more than half a century. Clement said Barnaby had given it to him 3 weeks before he died during a private meeting that Clement had thought at the time was simply one of the pastoral check-ins that Barnaby occasionally requested in his later years. He said Barnaby had been very specific. The envelope was to go to Marguerite after the service. Not before, not during, after. Marguerite took the envelope. She did not open it in the church. She put it in the inner pocket of her coat close against her chest and thanked Clement in the same quiet voice she had been using all morning. Clement held her hand for a moment before releasing it. He said he did not know what was in the envelope, but he said that Barnaby, during that last meeting 3 weeks before his death, had asked him a question that Clement had been turning over ever since. Barnaby had asked whether it was ever too late to do the right thing. Clement had told him it was never too late, that the best time was always right now. Barnaby had nodded, thanked him, and left. Marguerite looked at Clement for a long moment. Then she put her hand over the pocket where the envelope rested, nodded once, and walked out of Trinity Lutheran into the pale October morning. She did not open the envelope until she was in her car alone with the engine running and the heater doing its best against the autumn cold. She slid her finger under the seal carefully, the way she had always approached anything that deserved her full attention. Inside was a single sheet of Barnaby's personal stationery folded once. He had written Marguerite, "When the time comes, and you will know when it comes, go to Merriweather Station. Drawer 7. Go alone. All my love, Barnaby." She read it twice. Then she folded it back the way it had been and sat in the parking lot of Trinity Lutheran for several minutes, listening to the wind move through the oak trees that lined the church driveway. Merriweather Station. She had never heard that name from Barnaby's mouth, but she knew what the word Merriweather connected to because 20-some years ago, over a dinner, she had nearly forgotten Barnaby had mentioned an Aldous Merriweather in passing, while describing something he was reading about Northern County land history. He had mentioned the name once briefly and then pivoted to something else in the particular way that Barnaby sometimes changed subjects when he did not want to be followed further down a path. Marguerite had filed that pivot away without understanding why. She had a long habit of noting the things people were careful not to say. She had been married to this man for 53 years, and he had left her a direction and a drawer number and the word alone. She started the car and drove back to the house on Alderton Lane. Barnaby Pemberton had died 7 weeks earlier, quietly in his sleep, the way the people who loved him had always hoped he would go. He was 86 sharp to the very end, still doing crossword puzzles in ink, still reading 2 newspapers a morning, still calling his clients on their birthdays. He had not suffered. That was the thing Marguerite had held on to through the weeks of arrangements and paperwork and condolences. He had not suffered, and she had been there sleeping beside him when it happened. She had woken at 4 in the morning to find the room unusually still. She had known before she reached for him. After 53 years, she knew the quality of his presence in a room, and she knew immediately when it was absent. Marguerite Pemberton was born in 1942 in Brattleboro, Vermont, the second of four children raised by a watchmaker, father and a school teacher, mother in a house where money was modest and books were everywhere. Her father had a particular philosophy about complexity. He believed that anything that seemed impossibly intricate could be understood if you were patient enough to take it apart one piece at a time. He applied this to watches. Marguerite had applied it to everything else. Her mother had a different but equally durable philosophy. She told her daughters repeatedly and without apology that a woman's mind was the one possession no one could remove without her explicit permission. Marguerite had believed this the way she believed in gravity, not because someone told her to, but because the evidence was overwhelming. She had studied urban planning at the State University on a partial scholarship, working dinner shifts at a diner near campus to cover what the scholarship did not. She graduated near the top of her class and took a position at the regional planning office in Dunmore Crossing, where she spent her first years producing work that regularly appeared under other people's names in official reports. She had documented everything from the beginning, not in anger but in the calm recognition that competence required a paper trail if it was ever going to be provable. In 1969, she had drafted an internal grievance about attribution practices. The night before she intended to file it, she had encountered Barnaby Pemberton in the hallway outside the records room. He had been working late, which he always was. He looked at the folder in her hands and said without preamble that the grievance was correct on principle, but would cost her the coup and change nothing. She had asked him what he thought she should do instead. He said he genuinely did not know. But he said that she was considerably smarter than the question she was asking, and he trusted she would figure out an answer that was both true and useful. She had not filed the grievance. Instead, she had continued documenting everything, building a record so comprehensive and so carefully organized that by 1972, it was simply impossible to reassign her work without her fingerprints remaining all over it. By 1975, she was the most indispensable person in the office, and everyone knew it, including the people who had once taken her credit. Barnaby had proposed 6 months after that hallway conversation on the stone steps of the old Dunmore Crossing courthouse at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday in March, holding a small box and delivering what Marguerite later described as the least eloquent proposal she had ever heard from someone she considered highly intelligent. She had said yes before he finished a sentence. Their marriage was a partnership in the fullest sense. Barnaby built his consulting firm from a single contract into a respected regional institution over 30 years, and Marguerite was the structural engineer of much of what made it function. She managed client relationships, developed the operational systems that kept the firm organized through 3 recessions and one genuinely catastrophic year in the markets, and handled financial oversight with the rigor of someone who understood that integrity was a long-term investment. She did all of this without requiring recognition, not from false modesty, but because she measured her days by what she had accomplished, not by whether anyone had applauded. Mortimer was 12 when Barnaby and Marguerite married. He was a quiet, watchful boy who had grown up primarily with his mother after the divorce, visiting Barnaby on school holidays and alternating summers. Marguerite had made consistent effort. She had learned his preferences, attended the school events to which he was invited, and treated him with the steady warmth of someone who understood that damaged children often tested the people who tried to reach them. There had been one night when Mortimer was 17 that Marguerite thought about sometimes. He had been in a bicycle accident, nothing life-threatening but frightening enough, and Barnaby had been in Boston for a client emergency. Marguerite had stayed at Dunmore General through the night, sitting in a plastic chair outside his room, drinking bad coffee from the machine in the hallway. She had been there when the doctor came to say he was going to be fine. She had been there when Mortimer woke up. When Barnaby came the next morning, Mortimer did not tell him Marguerite had stayed. He thanked his father for coming back quickly. He nodded at Marguerite across the room. That was all. It was not cruelty. Marguerite had understood that even then. It was a 17-year-old boy who did not know how to acknowledge needing someone because no one had ever taught him that needing people was something you were allowed to do. That gap, the one between knowing you needed something and being able to receive it, had followed Mortimer Pemberton his entire adult life, and eventually it had shaped him into the kind of man who filled it with other things. He was 54 now, broad-shouldered, expensively dressed. He had met Celestine 16 years ago and married her 11 years back, and whatever trajectory he might have taken before that point had been efficiently redirected by a woman who assessed every relationship in terms of its instrumental value and had assessed Mortimer as someone with significant potential provided he was properly focused. Celestine had made one attempt to establish rapport with Marguerite early in the marriage, arriving for Thanksgiving with a wrapped book that she presented as something she thought Marguerite would love. It was a history of New England architecture published 3 years earlier. Marguerite had thanked her with genuine warmth and placed it on the shelf in the study directly beside the same book. Same publisher, same edition that she had owned since 1985. She had not moved either book. When Celestine visited, which was infrequently, Marguerite had noticed that Celestine never went into the study. So the two books stood side by side for 11 years, quietly demonstrating the difference between performing attention and actually paying it. The morning the will was read had been 7 weeks after the funeral, and Marguerite had known before she walked into Attorney Stonebridge's office on the 3rd floor of the building downtown that the news would not be simple. Barnaby had been too careful in his final year, too deliberate in small ways she had noticed and cataloged without comment. He had reorganized certain files. He had spent a great deal of time with lawyers she had not been introduced to. He had mentioned Mortimer with increasing warmth, the particular warmth of someone who was trying very hard to believe in something. Marguerite had raised her concerns once carefully without accusation. Barnaby had listened completely, which he always did, and had thanked her for telling him, which he always did, and had ultimately chosen to trust his son's intentions, which she had understood even when it troubled her. She had not known until she sat in Stonebridge's office listening to the disposition of Barnaby's estate that the extent of what Mortimer and Celestine had built while Barnaby was choosing to trust them. She heard the house on Alderton Lane go to Mortimer, the savings accounts and investment portfolios, the consulting firm's assets and client contracts, all of it. 53 years of shared construction, and it went to the man who had not told his father that Marguerite had stayed through the night. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face giving nothing away, and her heart doing something complicated that she had no intention of performing for an audience. Stonebridge removed his glasses, cleaned them with the deliberate patience of a man who has delivered this type of news many times, and said there was one additional item. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a property deed and an old iron key attached to a faded paper tag. The deed described 3.44 acres of land in the northern county near a lake called Harrow's Reach. The structure on the property was described as a cottage built approximately 1931, current condition unknown. Celestine looked at the tag and laughed. It was a brief, bright sound that contained no warmth whatsoever. She said something about a cottage in the middle of nowhere, about Barnaby finally being honest regarding what Marguerite deserved after all those years. Mortimer smiled in the careful way of someone performing theatrical pity. He said it was almost poetic, that the woman who had always preferred to stay in the background had been given a place where she could disappear completely. Marguerite picked up the envelope. She looked at Mortimer for a moment. His eyes, she noticed, moved away from hers before she looked away from his. Then she looked at Celestine, who did not look away, but whose smile shifted slightly in a way that suggested she was recalculating something. Marguerite thanked Stonebridge for his time and walked out of the office. Behind her, she heard Celestine saying something that made Mortimer laugh. She did not turn around to hear what it was. On the sidewalk outside in the pale October light, she opened the envelope again and found tucked behind the deed a folded letter in Barnaby's handwriting. She read it standing on the pavement with people moving past her in both directions. He wrote that he had kept this from her for reasons that had made sense to him at the time and that he hoped she would forgive the silence. He wrote that what waited for her at Harrow's Reach was not what anyone thought it was. He asked her to go there, to go alone, to look at what he had kept for her and for the world. He wrote that he had never doubted for a single moment that she was the only person on earth he could trust with what he had found. He ended it the way he always ended everything he wrote to her, with his whole love offered, without reservation. Marguerite folded the letter back along its original creases and placed it in her coat pocket beside the envelope Clement had given her after the service. She stood on the sidewalk for another minute, not thinking exactly, but settling the way water settles after it has been disturbed. Then she went home to get her bag. She had packed it the night before. She had not known why exactly, only that some instinct had directed her to do it, the same instinct that had made her write things down and build paper trails and file things carefully all her working life. The instinct that said, be ready before you know what you're being ready for. A change of clothes, her reading glasses, a thermos of strong coffee, a small flashlight, the leather notebook she had carried everywhere for 30 years, the one where she recorded questions and observations, and the occasional thought that seemed worth preserving. She was loading the bag into the car when Matilda Cromwell came out of the house next door. Matilda was 68, a retired head nurse from Dunmore General Hospital, who had spent 18 years there learning that honesty delivered early caused less damage than comfort delivered too late. She and Marguerite had been neighbors for 30 years. They were not intimate friends in the way of women who shared everything, but they were the kind of neighbors who knew each other's coffee order, who accepted packages and watered plants and could be trusted with a spare key. That was a form of closeness that Marguerite had come to value considerably. The truck from Mortimer's moving company was parked at the curb. Two men were carrying boxes out of the front door, directed by Celestine, who had arrived without announcement to begin the inventory process before the ink on the legal transfer was thoroughly dry. Matilda stood at her front gate and watched this for a moment. Then she looked at Marguerite. She asked what was happening. Marguerite told her briefly and without embellishment. The house had transferred to Mortimer. She was leaving. She had somewhere to be. Matilda was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is deciding which of several true things to say first. Then she asked if Marguerite wanted her to call a lawyer. Marguerite thanked her and declined. Matilda asked what she needed. Marguerite had not been planning to answer honestly. She had spent so long being the person who managed things that the habit of self-sufficiency had become nearly automatic. But Matilda was asking with the directness of a woman who had sat with people in crisis for nearly 2 decades and knew the difference between a question and a pleasantry and something, and Marguerite recognized that and responded to it. She said she needed to know she was not losing her mind for believing that Barnaby had not simply abandoned her. Matilda looked at her steadily. She said that Barnaby Pemberton had loved Marguerite in the particular and uncommon way of a man who understood what he had and never took a day of it for granted. She said she had watched them from next door for 30 years, and she was as certain of that as she had ever been certain of anything. Then she went inside and came back with a small tin of the butter cookies she made every October, the ones with the lemon zest that Marguerite had been eating at Matilda's kitchen table since 1994. She pressed the tin into Marguerite's hands. Marguerite held it. Something in her chest shifted in a way she did not entirely have words for. Matilda began to go back inside and then stopped. She turned back and said that before Marguerite left, she ought to ask Clement Prescott about the last private meeting he had with Barnaby. She said she thought Marguerite should know what Barnaby had said. She said it with the careful tone of someone delivering information they have been carrying for a while and are glad to finally set down. Marguerite thanked her. She put the tin of cookies on the passenger seat of her car next to the bag she had packed and drove north out of Dunmore Crossing as the October morning opened up around her. The route took her through the familiar streets of town and then out onto the county road that headed north where the suburban geography gradually gave way to farmland and then to something older and quieter. The trees here were enormous oak and elm and stands of white birch that caught the light and turned it the particular silver that belongs only to New England in October. The road signs became less frequent. The pavement narrowed, then surrendered to gravel, then to a packed dirt track bordered on both sides by undergrowth that pressed close like a crowd leaning towards something they wanted to see. Somewhere around the second hour of driving, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Mortimer. She looked at his name for 3 full seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the seat beside the cookies and kept driving. It was not avoidance. She would deal with Mortimer when she understood what she was dealing with. Marguerite had spent her career learning that you did not engage with a situation before you had enough information to engage with it usefully. She had one piece of paper with a name and a drawer number and a letter from her husband telling her to go alone, and 40 years of trusting that Barnaby Pemberton did not do things without reasons. That was enough to drive on. The track curved gradually downhill in its final half mile and then opened without warning into a clearing so unexpected and so precisely itself that Marguerite stopped the car completely and simply sat for a moment, engine idling. Harrow's Reach was a lake of unusual stillness. Its surface held the pale sky in its reflection with the precision of a mirror broken only by the occasional expansion of a fish ring near the center. The water was dark and clear simultaneously, the kind of color that suggested considerable depth. A family of Canada geese moved in a loose formation along the far shore. A stand of willows trailed their lower branches along the eastern bank. And there at the western edge of the clearing, where the land rose slightly before meeting the tree line, was the cottage. It was not what the deed's cautious legal language had prepared her for. It was built of pale local stone, the kind quarried from these hills in the 1930s, and fitted together with workmanship that had outlasted nearly a century of Massachusetts winters. The roof had been repaired at some point, not recently, but not so long ago that it had failed again. The windows were intact, clouded with grime, but unbroken. A wooden dock extended 20 feet into the lake, its boards weathered to silver but still solid in their framing. Above the front door, carved directly into the stone lintel, were 2 words: Merriweather Station, 1931. Marguerite sat in the car and looked at those 2 words for a long time. She had known the name Merriweather meant something. She had not known it meant this. She got out of the car and walked across the grass toward the cottage, and it was then standing 20 feet from the front door with the October wind moving through the clearing around her and the lake perfectly still at her back that she realized she had seen this building before. Not in person, in a photograph. A small black and white photograph in an album that Barnaby kept in the bottom drawer of his study desk, a personal album he had never offered to show her, and that she had never asked to see, because in 53 years of marriage, they had both understood that some private things remained private, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. She had seen the photograph once by accident when she was looking for a pen and had opened the wrong drawer. A black and white image of a stone building at the edge of dark water, taken from roughly the same angle at which she was now standing. She had noticed it, registered it, closed the drawer, and thought nothing more of it. She thought about it now. She walked the rest of the way to the door, took the iron key from her coat pocket, and fitted it into the lock. It turned with almost no resistance, the lock yielding like a door that had been waiting to be opened and had been ready for some time. Marguerite noted this but said nothing to no one. She pushed the door inward, and it opened with a sound like a long, slow exhale. She stepped inside, and that was when she heard the footsteps on the floor above her. The footsteps stopped. Marguerite did not move. She stood just inside the doorway with the afternoon light at her back and the dim interior of the cottage stretching ahead of her, and she held the flashlight at her side without turning it on. She had spent enough years in planning meetings to know that the person who reacts first rarely controls what happens next. The silence stretched for perhaps 10 seconds. Then a figure appeared at the top of the narrow staircase in the far corner of the room, moving carefully, one hand braced against the wall. An older man, heavy-set through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who is also waiting to understand what he is looking at. He was perhaps 70, perhaps a year or two either side, and he wore a canvas work jacket with dried mortar on the left sleeve and the general appearance of a man who had spent his life doing things with his hands rather than talking about them. He looked at Marguerite for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but the release of a tension that had been held for a considerable time. He said her name, not as a question. His name was Thaddeus Hartwell. He told her this without being asked, in the manner of someone who understood that the situation required explanation before anything else could proceed. He was 71 years old, a general contractor who had been working in and around the northern county for 4 decades. Barnaby Pemberton had hired him 3 times in the past 10 years to perform maintenance work on this property, always in late May, always in cash, always during the specific window when Marguerite was in Vermont visiting her sister. He had not been told why the work needed to happen during those particular weeks. He had not asked. Barnaby had said only that he needed the building to keep standing and that the right person would eventually come to understand why. Thaddeus had spent 5 years carrying that explanation. He described it as the most unusual professional relationship of his career, which was saying something given 40 years of working for people with strong opinions about load-bearing walls. Marguerite looked at him for a moment, then at the room around her, then back at him. She asked if he had been upstairs checking the roof timbers when he heard her car on the track. He said he had come down from the upper level when he heard the engine. He had been inspecting the ridge beam, which needed attention before the next winter. He had not expected anyone until he heard the approach. Marguerite processed this. She looked at the floor beneath her feet, at the pale stone flags laid in their careful grid, and she noted for the first time what she had not registered in her first survey of the room. She noted it and kept it. She reached into her coat and produced the envelope with the deed and the letter. She held it out. Thaddeus took it and read Barnaby's letter slowly, the way a man reads something that is confirming what he already suspected but wanted to be certain of before he committed to the next action. When he finished, he handed it back without a word and nodded once. He went to the inside breast pocket of his work jacket and produced a second envelope. It was worn at the edges from years of being carried and transferred from jacket to jacket. Thaddeus said he had moved it to a new coat every winter for 5 years. He said he had never opened it. Inside was a note in Barnaby's handwriting, dated 14 months ago, considerably closer to the end than Marguerite had realized Barnaby knew it was. Barnaby wrote Thaddeus, "Thank you for everything you have kept standing. When Marguerite arrives, show her the second lock. She will know what to do." Marguerite read it once, folded it, put it in her pocket with the other letters. She was collecting Barnaby's handwriting the way she had once collected documentation, one careful piece at a time, building towards something she could not yet fully see but trusted was coherent. She said she would like to see the second lock. Thaddeus led her to the fireplace. The fireplace occupied most of the north wall, built from the same pale stone as the cottage exterior, with a cast iron grate and a broad stone hearth worn smooth by generations of feet that no longer existed. Marguerite had looked at it when she first stepped inside. She had noted the grate, the ash shadow on the fireback, the general integrity of the construction. She had not noticed the small recessed panel set into the iron of the fireback itself, positioned at exactly the height a standing person's hand would naturally fall while tending a fire. It was perhaps 3 inches square, its edges flush with the surrounding iron, and the only thing distinguishing it from the rest of the fireback's surface was a slight variation in texture that became apparent only when the afternoon light hit it at the correct angle. Inside the recess was a keyhole. Thaddeus had never touched it, he said. He had seen it on his first visit, had recognized that it was intentional rather than incidental, and had understood that it was not his business. Marguerite took the iron key from her pocket, the same key that had opened the front door with almost no resistance, and she understood now what she had only half understood then. The front door lock had yielded too easily. It was a test, not a barrier. She fit the key into the fireback panel. The key turned with a precision and solidity that belonged to a different order of engineering than the front door. She felt it engage 3 separate points of contact in sequence, and then she heard something underneath her feet, a deep and measured mechanical sound, the kind that suggested counterweights in carefully balanced stone, the kind that had been designed to function reliably across not years but decades. 3 of the flagstones near the left corner of the hearth shifted almost imperceptibly, at first, then dropped a half-inch in unison and slid cleanly to the side along the channels cut into the subfloor below, revealing a rectangular opening in the stone and the top of a staircase descending into darkness. Thaddeus stood very still and looked at it. He said quietly that he had spent 5 years keeping the building sound and had never known what was underneath it. Marguerite turned on her flashlight and directed the beam downward. The steps were dressed limestone pale and smooth, each one finished with a care that communicated intent. These were not utility stairs. They had been built for something that deserved a proper approach. She told Thaddeus she was going down alone. She said it without apology and without explanation, and he accepted it without either, which confirmed her initial assessment of him as a man who understood the difference between what was his and what was not. She descended 14 steps to the first landing. The air changed almost immediately, growing cooler and taking on a particular quality that Marguerite recognized after a moment: the smell of cedar and beeswax, the double signature of deliberate, sustained preservation. Someone had maintained conditions down here. Someone had been keeping this place alive. She thought of Thaddeus's envelopes, one per year for 5 years. She thought of Barnaby's consulting visits to the county, the ones she had attributed to old client relationships and had never questioned, because Barnaby had old client relationships everywhere. She adjusted her understanding of the past 5 years. 11 more steps and another curve. The walls were fitted stone, tight and dry, with no evidence of water intrusion. 7 more steps and the staircase ended. The chamber was larger than she had prepared herself for. Marguerite stood at the foot of the stairs with the flashlight beam sweeping slowly across what waited there. And for a moment she simply stopped and breathed and let her eyes do the work her mind had not yet caught up to. The room ran perhaps 50 feet in length and 30 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling of fitted stone arching 12 feet overhead. The construction was extraordinary. the kind of work that required both significant resources and a builder who understood that this structure needed to outlast not just its creator, but the entire context in which it had been made. Along every wall ran the shelving units of dark hardwood floor to ceiling, each section fronted with glass panels and fitted with brass hardware that had oxidized to a deep warm tone. Down the center of the room ran a series of flat display cases mounted on low pedestals, their glass surfaces covered in a fine layer of dust, but their contents visible through it, arranged on faded velvet with the care of someone who had thought very seriously about how things should be found. Marguerite moved to the nearest display case and looked through the glass. Jewelry, rings, brooches, cufflinks, pendants, each piece accompanied by a small, handwritten card. She bent closer and read the first one. Property of Aldous and Martha Bergheim. Deposited September 1938, Frankfurt. One pair of gold cufflinks in one woman's sapphire brooch. She moved to the next. Property of Nandita Osman Lahore. Deposited March 1947. And the next. Property of Yuki Tanaka, San Francisco. Deposited February 1942. Marguerite straightened up. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the full length of the shelving along the walls at the wrapped forms she could see through the glass, the edges of frames visible at the borders of their protective coverings, the contours of objects nested in materials that had hardened around them over many decades. She understood where she was. She had spent her career in planning and documentation, in the management of records, in the preservation of evidence, and she understood immediately and completely what kind of place this was and what it had been made to do. She took her leather notebook from her coat pocket and began writing. She noted the dimensions of the room, the construction quality, the preservation conditions. She noted the number of display cases visible from the center position, the number of shelving sections, the estimated volume of material present. She did this before she moved to look at anything else, because the habit was not simply professional reflex. It was, she recognized as she wrote, an act of respect. These things had been waiting to be counted. She would count them. She found the ledger on a shelf near the far wall, a thick volume bound in dark green cloth with a brass clasp that had not been opened in some time but yielded without much resistance. Inside, Aldous Merriweather had recorded every transaction in two-column deposits on the left, returns on the right. Items that had been reclaimed were marked with a small check in the right column. There were many checks. There were also many entries with no mark at all. She turned to the entry for September 14th, 1938, and found the Bergheims. She found Yuki Tanaka on a February page in 1942, 3 days after the executive order. She found entry after entry, each one a human life reduced to an object and a date and a place of origin by necessity, because the object and the date and the place of origin were all that could be safely committed to paper. Then she found it, November 19th, 1938. A man, no name, only initials. Essa, Boston. One bookcloth bound, one ring platinum engraved, R.A. December 12th, 1931. She turned to the corresponding journal on the shelf above Merriweather's personal account, rather than the formal ledger, and found the entry for that same evening. He wrote that a man had come alone after dark without announcement. He had carried nothing except a cloth bag with the book and the ring inside it. He said his wife and daughter had not made it across the border. He did not elaborate on what that meant because in November of 1938, it did not require elaboration. He left the bag and asked only for a receipt. Merriweather gave him one. The man walked back out into the dark. Merriweather wrote, "I did not ask his name. I had no right to it. I only made the promise." Marguerite read that sentence twice. Then she took her pen and wrote it at the top of a fresh page in her notebook in her own handwriting, as if by transcribing it, She was extending the promise through another set of hands. She did not fully understand why she did this. She understood that she needed to. She closed the journal and moved toward the back of the room where a desk stood behind the final row of shelving. On the desk was a second journal where its binding less worn. Beside it, a folded letter she recognized before she had taken 2 steps toward it. Barnaby's handwriting on the outside fold. Her name. She sat down at the desk chair, which creaked under her weight with the sound of wood that had been patient for a very long time, and she opened the journal first. The first entry was dated 1987. Barnaby's careful, slightly left-leaning script, the handwriting she would have known in any context and in any light. He wrote about driving up to the northern county after his cousin's estate had transferred the property to him, a distant connection he had never met in person, whose relationship to Aldous Merriweather he had not initially understood. He wrote about finding the cottage, about the front door opening easily, about the flagstone floor, about noticing the fireplace, and eventually the panel he could not explain, and the lock he could not open because he did not yet have the key. He wrote that he had found the key 6 months later tucked inside the spine of a book in the cousin's estate library with a note attached in handwriting he did not recognize that said simply, "For the station when the time is right." He wrote about coming back with the key, about the stairs, about standing at the bottom and swinging a flashlight across the room and sitting down on the stone floor because there was no chair and he needed to sit. He wrote that he spent the following 3 weeks reading Merriweather's journals from beginning to end. He wrote that by the end he understood what he had been given and what it required of him. He had not called anyone. He had not consulted anyone. He had simply decided in the way that Barnaby Pemberton made decisions, which was quietly and completely, that this was now his responsibility, and he would carry it for as long as he was able. 37 years. He had maintained the vault. He had upgraded the preservation systems where possible, working with Thaddeus Hartwell for the last 5 of those years when the task exceeded what he could manage alone. He had kept meticulous records. He had identified the legal framework governing the contents, a provision of a state law sufficiently obscure that almost no one outside specialized inheritance practice would have encountered it, which specified that items held in private trust for more than 80 years with no documented surviving claimants passed to the property holder in full. Barnaby had verified this provision through 3 separate attorneys in 3 separate states, none of whom he had told the full context. He had simply asked a precise hypothetical question and collected 3 consistent answers. Then he had written it all down here in this journal in the chamber beneath the cottage, in the handwriting Marguerite would have known anywhere. She opened the letter last. He wrote Marguerite, "If you have found this, then you have done exactly what I knew you would do. You paid attention. You were patient. You trusted the process instead of the panic. The vault and everything in it belongs to you now legally and completely, with the exception of any items whose rightful heirs can still be found. Those must be returned, and I know you will see to that without needing to be told. I have left a full accounting with Josephine Dunmore, an attorney in Dunmore Crossing, whose information is in the green folder in the desk upstairs. She has been expecting your call for some time. I am sorry I kept this from you for so long. I kept it because I needed to be certain Mortimer had shown his hand before you knew what you were holding. I needed you to walk into that office not knowing so that your response would be genuine, so that Mortimer would believe he had won completely. He needed to feel safe enough to stop being careful. I love you. I trust you. Now go to work, Barnaby." Marguerite folded the letter along its original creases. She sat at the desk in the vault for a long time after that, in the cedar-scented quiet with the soft weight of Barnaby's handwriting in her hands, and 77 years of other people's trust arranged along the walls around her. She thought about what it meant to be the person someone chose, not for a moment or a transaction or a season, for 37 years of sustained silent faith. Then she stood, put the letter in her pocket, took her notebook, and climbed back up to the light. Thaddeus was still there, sitting on the stone hearth with a thermos of coffee, waiting in the patient posture of a man who had learned decades ago that some jobs require waiting, and that waiting is its own form of skilled labor. He looked up when she came through the flagstone opening. He did not ask what she had found. He waited. Marguerite told him she would need him to continue the maintenance work officially, this time with a contract and a proper accounting. She said she had some decisions to make and some calls to place, and that she would be back within the week. She asked if the building was sound enough to spend a night in. Thaddeus said he had made sure of it 5 years running. He said there was a bedroll in the upstairs closet left for exactly this possibility. Marguerite thanked him. He nodded, capped his thermos, and began packing his tools. At the door, he paused. He said that Barnaby had told him during their third work session that the property held something important. He said he had asked what kind of important. Barnaby had looked at him for a moment and then said the kind that matters to people who are no longer here to say so. Thaddeus said he had thought about that answer for 5 years. He said he thought he understood it better now. He left, and Marguerite heard his truck on the track, and then there was only the sound of the lake and the October wind through the clearing and the particular silence of a place that has been kept faithfully for a very long time. She went back downstairs. She stood at the desk and opened her notebook to the page where she had written, Merriweather's sentence. I did not ask his name. I had no right to it. I only made the promise. Below it, she wrote S.A. Boston, R.A. 12.6.1931. One book, one ring, no return mark. She underlined the last 3 words. Then she began working through the ledger systematically, page by page, making her own record of every unmarked entry. There were 41 of them, 41 items or collections of items whose owners had never come back, or whose children had never come back, or whose grandchildren had grown up not knowing there was anything to come back for. This was the work Barnaby's letter had pointed her toward. This was the thing she needed to do before anything else. She worked until the light through the upstairs windows had gone from gold to gray to dark. And then she sat for a while longer in the chamber with the flashlight propped against the desk, going through the ledger by its narrow beam, writing names and dates and places of origin into her notebook with the same steady hand that had been filling notebooks for 30 years. She thought about the ring, platinum engraved with initials and a date, June 12, 1931. A wedding date, almost certainly. Samuel Adler, if the initials in the ledger were right. Rose Adler, the R on the ring. A man who had come alone on a November night in 1938 and walked back out into the dark, and the ring he had left behind, and the promise Merriweather had made to him in the absence of his name. Marguerite did not yet know if there was anyone left to find. She only knew she needed to look. That the looking needed to come before anything else, before the attorneys and the appraisers and the legal framework and the confrontation with Mortimer, that she understood was coming whether she invited it or not. She closed the ledger and the notebook and climbed the stairs for the last time that night. She slept in the upstairs loft on Thaddeus's bedroll, with the lake visible through the small window and the sound of nothing at all coming through the old stone walls, and she did not find it difficult. She had slept in harder places with heavier things on her mind. 3 weeks later, a man showed up at the edge of the clearing. He arrived in a county assessor's truck, which Marguerite noted was not a county assessor's truck. She knew county vehicles, had worked alongside them for 30 years, and the paint on this one was a shade too dark and the registration plate was 6 months past its annual county sticker date. She noted this the way she noted everything, which was completely and without immediate comment. The man was 49 years old. She later determined, though, he presented himself as older in the indeterminate way of someone who has learned that looking institutional moves most conversations in a useful direction. He wore a canvas jacket and carried a clipboard with the convincing weight of official paperwork. He said he was conducting a routine property survey for the county assessor's office. Marguerite asked for his credentials, not as a challenge, simply as a request stated in the same tone she would use to ask for a menu. He produced a card. She looked at it, photographed it with her phone, while appearing to examine it, and handed it back. Then she did what she had always done with people who wanted to use a conversation as a cover for something else. She gave him the conversation without the cover. She stood with him on the far side of the clearing from the cottage, discussing soil drainage characteristics and setback regulations in the northern county in the specific and unhurried manner of someone who has personally worked with those regulations and finds them genuinely interesting. She watched his eyes. They moved to the cottage windows 3 times in the first 5 minutes. The east window specifically. Each time he redirected his attention back to her with the micro adjustment of a man catching himself doing something he had intended not to do. After 20 minutes, she told him she would contact the assessor's office directly if she needed any follow-up, thanked him for his time, and walked back toward the cottage. She did not look back. That evening, she called Josephine Dunmore, whose number she had found in the green folder, exactly where Barnaby said it would be, and who answered on the second ring the manner of someone who had been keeping a particular phone number near the top of her contact list for some time. Marguerite described the man and the truck and the registration plate number she had memorized. She said she suspected the visit had not been official. Josephine said she would look into it and would call back within 48 hours. She called back in 36. The truck was registered to a private investigations firm operating out of 2 counties south. The firm had been contracted 3 weeks earlier by a holding company that Josephine's researcher had traced through 2 levels of incorporation before finding the name of the registered agent, a paralegal who worked for a law firm whose primary client list included Celestine Bancroft Pemberton. Not Mortimer. Celestine. A separate contract, a separate payment trail, a separate decision. Marguerite sat with this information for a moment. Then she said aloud to no one in particular that she found it illuminating that Celestine had moved without consulting her husband. It suggested Celestine did not fully trust Mortimer to do what needed to be done, which in turn suggested that the partnership between them was less unified than it appeared from the outside. She filed this away. It would be useful to understand the fault lines before the ground shifted. The man's name Josephine had found was Clifton Ashford. He had a reasonable professional reputation in the area, neither distinguished nor compromised the record of someone who had been doing workmanlike investigative work for 20 years without particularly distinguishing himself in either direction. He called Josephine Dunmore himself 4 days after his visit to the property. Josephine told Marguerite about it that same evening. She said Clifton Ashford had called to say he was withdrawing from the Celestine Bancroft Pemberton contract. He had offered no extended explanation. He said only that he had done enough jobs in his career that he was not proud of, and he preferred to limit the ones he added to that list. He had also, without being asked, emailed Josephine a summary of what Celestine had hired him to document the condition of the property, any evidence of significant improvements or installed infrastructure, the approximate cost of modifications, and whether the property showed signs of containing anything of commercial value beyond its assessed land worth. Marguerite read the summary when Josephine forwarded it. She read it twice. Then she said that Clifton Ashford had just told Celestine's attorneys inadvertently that there was something worth looking for. Because a man does not voluntarily withdraw from a paid contract and document his original instructions unless he wants to establish for the record that someone else was responsible for what was being attempted. Clifton Ashford, she concluded, was protecting himself, which meant he had seen enough during his visit to understand that what was being attempted carried some risk, and that he preferred not to be holding the end of that rope when someone pulled it. She respected this. It was not heroism. It was a man at 49 deciding he had enough runway left to be selective about what he attached his name to. She called Sylvester Ravenswood that same night. Sylvester Ravenswood was 58, a financial forensics specialist whose name had been in the second green folder in the Cottage desk alongside Josephine's with a note from Barnaby that said simply, "Sylvester has been working on this for 18 months. He knows what he knows." Sylvester met her in person at a coffee shop in Dunmore Crossing. She had suggested because he had told her on the phone that some things were better said without any electronic record of the saying. He arrived 10 minutes early, which Marguerite noted with quiet approval. He laid it out without preamble. Mortimer and Celestine had been redirecting money from Barnaby's consulting firm for 6 years through a structure of shell accounts and falsified invoices. The method was sophisticated enough to survive casual examination, but had not been designed to withstand someone who was specifically looking. Sylvester had been specifically looking on Barnaby's behalf for 18 months. The total was just over $2 million. Marguerite listened to this without changing her expression. When Sylvester finished, she asked how long she needed to wait before moving. Sylvester said 3 months if she intended to maintain the element of surprise. He said Mortimer was beginning to feel pressure from somewhere. He could see it in the patterns of financial movement, small adjustments that indicated awareness without full information. He said if Mortimer was allowed to feel genuinely cornered before Marguerite was positioned, he would have the resources to make her life very difficult for a sustained period. Marguerite said she understood. She said she needed 3 months for something else as well, something she was working on independently. Sylvester did not ask what it was. She drove back to Merriweather Station in the dark on the now familiar track with the thermos Matilda had sent with her and the notebook in her bag, and 41 names still waiting in her careful handwriting. She parked in the clearing and sat for a moment before going inside. Then she called directory assistants for Philadelphia and asked if they had a listing for a David Adler on the east side of the city. There was a listing. She wrote the number in her notebook. She would call in the morning when her voice was rested and her words would be precise because what she intended to say to the person on the other end of that line was going to require everything she had learned in 82 years about delivering truth to people who did not yet know they were about to receive it. Matilda called that same night just before Marguerite went upstairs to sleep. She said she had spoken with Clement Prescott again. She said Clement had told her the full account of his last meeting with Barnaby 3 weeks before the end, the meeting Marguerite already knew about from Clement himself at the funeral. But Matilda had asked Clement for the part he had not told Marguerite at the funeral, the part Clement had kept back because he was not sure it was his to share. She said Clement had told her that after Barnaby asked his question about whether it was ever too late to do the right thing, and after Clement had answered, Barnaby had sat quietly for a long moment. Then he had said that he was not afraid of dying. He said what concerned him was the possibility that in all his years of trying to be careful and patient and strategic, he might have been too slow. He had looked at Clement and said, "I hope I have not waited too long to give Marguerite what she is owed." Clement had told him that if his arrangements were in order, it was not too late. Barnaby had said they were in order. As of that morning, Matilda finished the story and fell silent. Marguerite sat in the upstairs loft of Merriweather Station with the phone against her ear and the dark lake visible through the small window and the sound of nothing coming through the old stone walls. She had not cried since the night she reached for Barnaby in the dark and found the room without him. She had been too busy, too purposeful, too directed by his handwriting and his intentions in the 41 names in her notebook. But the idea of him sitting across from Clement Prescott and saying, "I hope I have not waited too long to give Marguerite what she is owed," the image of Barnaby Pemberton in his final weeks worrying not about himself, but about whether he had been fast enough in his love for her. That was the thing that found the place her discipline did not fully cover. She sat in the quiet of the old stone building for a long time with the dark water outside and the vault below, and 37 years of Barnaby's faithfulness held in the walls around her. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, picked up her notebook, and wrote the Philadelphia number clearly at the top of the next clean page. There was a great deal still to do, and Barnaby had trusted her to do it. That was not something she intended to take lightly. David Adler drove 6 hours from Philadelphia. Marguerite had known he would from the tone of his voice during those first 30 seconds on the phone before she had finished explaining who she was and why she was calling. There was a quality to his silence, an intake of breath held too long before he spoke, that told her he had been carrying something without knowing it was a weight. People who have been carrying things without knowing often react that way when the thing is finally named. He was 67 years old. He had retired 2 years earlier from a career in civil engineering, which Marguerite found quietly appropriate. He arrived on a Thursday morning in early February when the ground was hard and the lake at Harrow's Reach had frozen at its edges and the willows were bare and gray against a sky the color of old pewter. She met him at the clearing's edge. He was a tall man, slightly stooped in the way of tall men who have spent decades bending toward other people's eye level, with a careful face and the deliberate movements of someone who understood that the day ahead was not ordinary and wanted to approach it accordingly. She brought him inside and made coffee. She had learned in her 8 decades that the ritual of coffee for difficult conversations was not a delay, but a preparation, a way of establishing that two people were going to take their time with something that deserved it. She told him what she knew. The ledger entry from November 19th, 1938. The initials S.A., one book, one platinum ring engraved R.A. June 12th, 1931. No return mark in the right column. David Adler sat across the kitchen table from her and listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that R.A. was Rose Adler, his grandmother. The date on the ring was the date of his grandparents' wedding. He said his grandfather Samuel had left Boston in the fall of 1938, trying to reach family in Frankfurt, a journey that he had always understood from the fragments his grandmother had kept through the years had not gone as planned. His grandfather had returned to Boston in late 1938 without the family members he had gone to reach. He had never fully explained what had happened on that trip, and Rose had not pressed him because some things a person carries alone and a good partner understands this. Samuel Adler had died in 1961. He had never mentioned a ring. David said his grandmother had kept the receipt, a small handwritten slip of paper she had stored in the lining of a winter coat that had passed through 3 family moves and survived 2 floods and a house fire. She had told David's mother that it was important and that someday someone would know what to do with it. His mother had told David the same thing, and David had thought for 40 years that the receipt was the artifact of a grief too private to investigate the kind of thing families preserve without being able to explain why. Marguerite took him down to the vault. He stood at the bottom of the stairs in the amber light and looked at what surrounded him with the expression of a man whose internal architecture is being rearranged by something he does not have a category for. Marguerite gave him a moment. She had learned to give people a moment in this room. She led him to case 7. She opened drawer 4. Inside, wrapped in archival cloth and nestled in a bed of preservation foam that Thaddeus had installed 3 years ago at Barnaby's direction, was a small cloth bag, the original cloth bag still tied with a piece of waxed cord that had hardened to the color of old honey. Beside it, on a card in Meriwether's handwriting, S.A. Boston, November 1938. David reached out and picked up the bag. He held it in both hands for a moment without opening it, the way a person holds something when they need to understand that it is real before they can proceed to what it contains. Then he untied the cord and opened it. The ring was there, and the book, a small cloth-bound volume of Keats that fit in a coat pocket. Its pages still sound despite the decades, preserved by the same conditions that had kept everything else in this room intact. David turned the ring over in his fingers and found the engraving. R.A. December 6th, 1931. He read it once, then he closed his hand around it. He stood that way for a long time. Marguerite stood beside him and did not speak because there was nothing to say that the room was not already saying. Finally, he looked at her and said that his grandfather had walked back out into the night in November of 1938, having left the only thing he had of Rose behind because he did not know if he was going to make it home, and he wanted something of her to be safe somewhere. Marguerite said she knew. David said his grandfather had made it home. He had lived 23 more years and never spoken of the ring. Marguerite said that some men carried the things they did in silence, not because they were hiding them, but because the carrying was the point. David looked at her when she said this. She understood from his expression that he heard something in it beyond the general. She did not explain further. She did not need to. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he carried the ring in his shirt pocket against his chest and the book under his arm. At the door of his car, he turned and looked at Marguerite standing in the clearing in her coat and said that he did not know how to thank her for this. She told him that the ring had not been waiting impatiently. It had simply been doing what it was made to do. He drove away down the frozen track, and Marguerite watched the car until it was gone, and then she stood in the clearing for a while in the February cold with the lake hard at its edges and the willows gray and bare and the cottage warm behind her. And she thought that this was what Barnaby had meant when he wrote that everything that matters is waiting. Not the vault, not the legal transfer or the financial accounting or the confrontation she knew was coming. This. The ring finding its way back to the hand of Samuel Adler's grandson 67 years after Samuel had walked out into the night without it. This was what the whole long structure of patience and stewardship had been built to make possible. She went back inside and called Josephine Dunmore. The legal challenge came from an unexpected direction. Mortimer had tried the property survey in February through Clifton Ashford, and that had ended when Ashford withdrew and documented his instructions in writing. He had tried the road access claim in March, and that had dissolved inside 48 hours when Sylvester produced the 1934 survey records. What he tried in the third week of March was something Marguerite had not anticipated in its specific form, though she had told Sylvester it would come from somewhere. He filed a petition for legal guardianship. The petition argued that Marguerite Pemberton, age 82, residing alone in a remote property under conditions that presented documented safety risks, exhibited signs of diminished capacity, affecting her ability to manage significant assets. It cited her age, her isolation, and a medical evaluation signed by a physician Marguerite had never seen, based on no examination Marguerite had consented to. Josephine called Marguerite the morning the filing appeared. Marguerite listened to the full description without interrupting. Then she asked which judge had been assigned. Josephine said Judge Leopold Wellesley, who had been on the Dunmore Crossing bench for 16 years and was known professionally for two things: an exceptional command of estate and probate law, and a documented intolerance for filings he considered strategic rather than substantive. Marguerite said she would be at the courthouse when required. She was. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late March, she sat in a formal courtroom for the first time in her life beside Josephine across a broad space of institutional carpeting from Mortimer and his attorney and Celestine, who had come because she needed to see it firsthand. Judge Wellesley was 61, compact and precise, with the bearing of a man who had processed a great deal of human behavior from his position and had developed strong opinions about which varieties he was willing to tolerate. He reviewed the petition in silence for several minutes before he spoke. He said he would hear from Mrs. Pemberton directly. Marguerite stood. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use rhetorical flourish. She described in sequence the precise legal status of every asset currently in her name, the relevant provisions of estate and trust law, governing the vault contents, the structure of the preservation and documentation work she had completed over the preceding months, the contractual arrangements she had made with Josephine Dunmore and Sylvester Ravenswood and Thaddeus Hartwell, and the current stage of the 41 name research project she was conducting through historical societies and genealogical networks. She then described the timeline of Mortimer's 3 legal attempts against the property in chronological order, with dates, and noted that the filing before the court today was the 4th action in 4 months, each preceding action having been withdrawn or dismissed after failing to identify any legal basis for the position it had advanced. She sat down. Judge Wellesley looked at Mortimer's attorney for a moment. Then he said that Mrs. Pemberton had just delivered a more detailed and legally coherent account of her own financial circumstances than he encountered from most attorneys in civil proceedings. He said the court found no basis for the petition. He dismissed it from the bench. It took 11 minutes from the moment Marguerite finished speaking. Outside on the courthouse steps, Marguerite stood in the March air and watched Mortimer walk to his car. Celestine was ahead of him, moving with the controlled speed of a woman who needed to be somewhere else before she allowed herself to react to what had just happened. Mortimer walked more slowly. He did not look back. Marguerite noted the particular quality of his walk. Not defeat exactly, something more complicated and less clean. The walk of a man who has spent considerable resources trying to reach a destination and has arrived instead at the understanding that the destination did not exist in the form he had imagined. She said nothing. There would be time for the larger conversation soon enough. The second approach came 9 days later through a woman named Sandra Croft. Sandra Croft was 45, a certified appraiser with a strong regional reputation and a client list that Josephine had been unable to immediately identify as problematic. She had been engaged through a legitimate referral channel, had presented credentials that were entirely valid, and had spent 2 productive days in the vault with Marguerite and another appraiser working systematically through the collection. On the 3rd morning, she arrived alone before the second appraiser and asked to speak with Marguerite privately. She proposed what she described as a discrete arrangement regarding 3 specific items in the collection pieces whose assessed value was significant enough that their handling through informal channels rather than formal transfer would benefit both parties considerably. Marguerite looked at her. She looked at the 3 items Sandra had specified, which were among the 41 unmarked entries items whose owners had not been found. She said she was going to say something once and not repeat it. She said she assumed Sandra understood what that meant. Sandra left within the hour. Marguerite called Josephine before she reached the end of the track. Josephine ran Sandra Croft's corporate registrations through her researcher by that afternoon and found what Marguerite had suspected: she would find an indirect connection to a consulting firm that Celestine Bancroft Pemberton had used for financial services over the past 4 years. Marguerite said she found it clarifying that Celestine's approach had moved from legal petitions to attempting to compromise the appraisal process. It indicated that the direct legal route had been closed off and that Celestine had concluded the assets in question were real and significant enough to justify further investment. She said this told her Celestine did not yet know the full assessed value, because if she did, she would not be sending someone to pick up 3 items. She would be mounting something considerably larger. Sylvester completed the full appraisal summary that same week, working with the replacement appraiser Josephine brought in. The total assessed value of the vault contents exceeded $40 million. Certain individual pieces carried historical significance that pushed their actual market worth considerably higher. Sylvester delivered this figure to Marguerite in person, as he had delivered the earlier information in the same coffee shop on a quiet Wednesday morning. He said the number twice to make sure she had heard it correctly. She had heard it correctly the first time. She said she appreciated his thoroughness. She said she would like to proceed with the conversation about Mortimer as soon as he was ready. He said he was ready now if she was. They met with Josephine the following week. The plan was straightforward in its structure, though it required precision in execution. Mortimer would be given an opportunity to resolve the matter privately. The terms were non-negotiable. The alternative was a referral to the district attorney's office with Sylvester's complete documentation, which was thorough enough that Josephine estimated a conviction probability above 90%. Marguerite drove to Merriweather Station that evening and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the lake in the last light. She was not anxious. She had spent 3 months building something that held its weight, and she knew it held because she had tested every joint. She thought about Barnaby, who had built something over 37 years that had also held its weight quietly without announcement through 4 decades of New England weather and changing times, and the ordinary accumulations of a long life lived beside her. She thought about the difference between the kind of strength that requires an audience and the kind that simply continues regardless of whether anyone is watching. Barnaby had been the second kind. She had tried to be. She thought perhaps she had managed it at least sometimes. They came on a Saturday morning in late March when the ice at Harrow's Reach had broken up and the lake was moving again in the particular tentative way of water relearning its own nature after a winter of stillness. She heard Mortimer's car on the track while she was finishing her second cup of coffee. She set the cup down, went to her bedroom, and dressed with the same consideration she had given to the most important meetings of her professional life. The dark wool dress she had worn to 3 client presentations that had changed the direction of the consulting firm. Low boots, and around her neck the jade necklace. The jade had come from Case 11, a collection deposited in March of 1942 by a craftsman from Kyoto, whose entry in Merriweather's ledger had no return mark. Josephine had confirmed its legal status 3 weeks ago. Each stone was carved into a delicate oval and set in oxidized silver with the attention of someone who understood that beauty was not decoration but argument. Marguerite stood before the mirror for 1 moment. Then she went back to her chair, picked up her book, and waited. Mortimer knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response. He and Celestine stepped inside and stopped. The cottage had become, over the preceding months, completely itself. Not decorated, not staged, but inhabited in the deep way of a space that has been thought about and cared for by someone who intended to remain. Books on the shelves, a fire in the grate, the 2 lamps positioned to make the stone walls hold warmth rather than show their age. The jade at Marguerite's throat, catching the light when she breathed. Celestine's eyes went to it immediately and stayed longer than she intended. Mortimer looked around the room with an expression Marguerite recognized as recalibration. He had come expecting one version of what he would find, and what he found was something that did not fit the version, and now he needed a moment to adjust his approach. He adjusted it toward concern. He said he had been worried about her. He said the property was remote. He said living alone at her age presented practical risks that he and Celestine had been thinking about, and that there were options available, comfortable and well-staffed, that might suit her considerably better than this. Marguerite set her book down. She let him finish. It was a comprehensive performance, the vocabulary of care arranged in the pattern of control, and she had been watching this particular arrangement long enough to read it without difficulty. She asked him about the property survey in February. She asked about the road access petition in March. She asked about the guardianship filing 2 weeks ago, the one that had been dismissed from the bench in 11 minutes. She asked directly, and without softening it, why he was suddenly concerned about her well-being, when 3 months ago he had laughed at a lawyer's desk about where she deserved to disappear to. Celestine said something sharp about family obligation and gratitude. Marguerite looked at her with the patience of someone who has sat across from stronger argument delivered by more formidable people and remained unmoved. She said she had a question for Mortimer. She asked how the financial review of Barnaby's consulting business was proceeding now that the estate had fully transferred. Mortimer said it was proceeding fine. Marguerite said she was glad to hear it. She said she found it interesting because the records she had reviewed told a rather different story. She said this without drama, in the same measured tone she had used to discuss drainage regulations with Clifton Ashford. The change in Mortimer's face was immediate and total. The color moved out of it in a way that had nothing to do with the performance. Celestine went very still. Marguerite stood and walked to the fireplace. She pressed the recessed panel in the fireback. She fit the key she now wore on a chain at her wrist. The sound came from beneath the floor, deep and measured, and the 3 flagstones shifted and sank and slid aside. She told them to come with her. She said she wanted to show them what Barnaby had actually left her. Mortimer looked at the opening in the floor. Then he looked at Celestine. Then he followed Marguerite down the stairs. Celestine made a sound at the bottom of the stairs that she immediately converted into silence. Mortimer stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, taking in the full length of the shelving along the walls, the display cases, the scope of what surrounded him. Marguerite walked them through it without theater. She explained Aldous Merriweather in 3 sentences. She explained the deposits in 4. She gave them the legal framework in 2. She cited the assessed value from memory. She watched Mortimer's face move through astonishment and arrive somewhere considerably less comfortable, the particular expression of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just been shown that every assumption was wrong. Then she went to the desk and picked up the folder Sylvester had prepared. She placed it on the surface in front of them and gave them time to read enough to understand the completeness of what it contained. Mortimer read with his shoulders held very still. Celestine read faster and went paler faster. Marguerite told them what would happen next. Mortimer would sign the consulting firm back to her with a full accounting of every asset removed since the transfer. He and Celestine would return the full amount through a structured repayment agreement that Josephine had already prepared. They would withdraw every pending legal action and terminate any further investigation of the property. They would do all of this quietly within the scope of their respective legal counsel in exchange for Marguerite's agreement to keep Sylvester's findings within that same scope, rather than delivering them to the district attorney's office. Mortimer asked what would happen if he refused. He asked it quietly, without the register of his earlier performances, the question of a man who already knows the answer but needs to hear it stated. Marguerite said she would make 1 phone call. She said the consequences of that call would follow him for the remainder of his professional life. She said the choice was his and she would give him a moment to make it. The vault was very quiet around them. Then Celestine said something in a low voice to Mortimer, not quite audible, and Mortimer nodded once in a way that meant it was over. He said he would sign. Celestine walked to the stairs without speaking and went up. Mortimer moved to follow her. At the foot of the stairs, he stopped. He stood with his back to Marguerite for a moment, looking up at the staircase. Then he turned around. He was not wearing the performance anymore. What his face held instead was something unguarded and considerably older, the face of a man seeing a thing clearly for what might be the first time. He looked at the shelves, at the display cases, at the cards visible through the glass. He looked at the room that his father had spent 37 years maintaining in silence. He said his father had never told him about this place. Marguerite said Barnaby had waited until Mortimer was ready to hear about it. Mortimer said he was never ready. Marguerite said she knew. She said Barnaby had known too. She said it was the thing that had cost Barnaby the most out of everything. Mortimer was quiet for a long time. When he finally moved toward the stairs, his step had something in it that had not been there when he came down. Not contrition, not resolution, but the particular weight of a man who has been shown the full dimensions of what he chose not to become. He would not change. Marguerite understood this without judgment, but he would carry the knowledge of it, and that was its own form of consequence. He went upstairs. Marguerite stood alone in the vault for a moment. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the cards in Meriwether's handwriting, and Barnaby's handwriting, and her own handwriting, where she had added new cards in the months of her stewardship. She looked at the 41 names in the ledger, diminished now to 34. As she worked through the list, 7 families found and 7 things returned. Then she turned off the light and climbed the stairs. 4 days later, in Josephine's office, the papers were signed in 40 minutes. Mortimer and Celestine did not look at Marguerite when they arrived, and did not look at her when they left. Josephine processed every document with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting a considerable time for a thing to be properly concluded and intends to do it correctly. Sylvester filed the supporting documentation in a secure archive. Marguerite drove back to Meriwether Station the same afternoon. The Pemberton Foundation was established in early summer. Josephine came on as lead counsel, leaving a firm she had outgrown without regret or ceremony. Sylvester continued his investigative work with proper resources and a mandate that was finally legible. Margaret Hale, who had spent 12 years running a nonprofit that helped elderly clients recover from financial exploitation, joined as administrator and became the operational center of what they built together. Their focus was precise, and they did not apologize for it. They took case and other organizations found too complicated, too old, too entangled in family feeling to pursue clearly. They were patient and thorough, and they did not mistake endurance for weakness in the people they helped, because Marguerite had spent 82 years learning that endurance and strength were not competing qualities, but the same quality at different distances. In their first 6 months, they recovered assets for 22 clients, a total approaching $4 million. Mathilda Cromwell called in August. She asked if the foundation would look at the situation of her closest friend, a woman of 74 whose nephew had been transferring money out of her accounts for 2 years while providing fabricated monthly statements. Marguerite said yes before Matilda had finished describing it. This was how the first case had come to them, and there was a particular rightness in it that Marguerite did not mention but noticed. The 41 names in the ledger became 29 by September, then 21 by the following spring. Each return was different. A woman in her 50s who received her great-uncle's silver pocket watch and spent an hour turning it in her hands at the kitchen table at Meriwether Station. A man of 40 who received a set of architectural drawings his grandfather had made of a house in Warsaw and had delivered to Meriwether in 1939, drawings of a house that no longer stood, which the man intended to frame and hang in the house his own children had grown up in. A family of 3 generations who arrived together on a Sunday afternoon and received a painted icon small enough to fit in a coat pocket that had traveled from Odessa to Meriwether Station in 1941 and had been waiting for them since. Each time Marguerite made coffee, each time she gave people a moment, each time she stood beside them in the vault, while they received what had been kept for them, and she understood that this was the specific gravity of what Barnaby had built, not the monetary value, not the legal significance, not even the historical weight of the collection. It was this, the moment of return, the closing of a distance that had been too long and too painful and had now finally been closed. Delphine Fairbanks arrived on a Wednesday evening in late September when the first cold had settled over the lake and the willows had begun their autumn turn. She sat in her car at the edge of the clearing for several minutes before getting out. Marguerite watched from the window and recognized the posture immediately. She had seen it on David Adler in February, on the family from Odessa in June, on others in between. It was the posture of someone holding a hope they are afraid to expose to the open air. Marguerite opened the door before Delphine reached it. Delphine Fairbanks was 31 years old, a fourth-grade teacher from Boston with her grandmother's folder pressed against her chest and the look of a woman who has driven 3 hours because a piece of paper has been burning a hole in her family for 2 generations. She sat at the kitchen table and showed Marguerite the receipt, handwritten in beautiful cursive dated 1947, property of Nandita Osman Lahore. One silk textile hand-embroidered, family heirloom. Marguerite read it and looked up. She said, Cabinet 7, Drawer 4. She said it had been waiting 78 years. Delphine pressed both hands over her mouth. Marguerite brought her tea first. They sat together at the table for 20 minutes, and Delphine told her about her grandmother, who had described the textile for her entire life in the particular way of someone keeping an object alive through language because they cannot hold it in their hands. She said her grandmother had called it the proof that beauty could survive anything. She said she had not understood what her grandmother meant until now. Then Marguerite brought her downstairs. The amber lights came on and the cedar-scented air settled around them, and Marguerite moved to Cabinet 7 and opened Drawer 4 and lifted out the archival package with both hands and set it on the examination table in the center of the room. Inside the archival wrapping was a length of silk folded with extraordinary care, its surface covered in embroidery so dense and so precise that it seemed to generate its own light. Gold and crimson thread in patterns of peacocks and flowering vines, every stitch placed by hands that had understood exactly what they were making and why it mattered. The colors were as vivid as the day they were completed. The cedar and beeswax had done what they were designed to do. Delphine reached out with 2 fingers and touched the edge of the fabric. She said her grandmother had described it her entire life, every detail, every color, every pattern, and she had always believed her, but she had never thought she would see it. She said she was sorry it had taken so long. Marguerite put her hand lightly on Delphine's shoulder and said that it had not been waiting impatiently. She said some things simply kept faith across whatever distance and time were required because the alternative was to stop being what they were, and these things had declined to do that. Delphine lifted the textile from its wrapping and held it against her chest, the silk against her coat, and the sound she made was not a word and did not need to be. Marguerite stood beside her in the vault beneath Meriwether Station, in the room that Aldous Meriwether had built in 1931 and Barnaby Pemberton had maintained for 37 years in silence. And Marguerite had inherited along with the responsibility of knowing what it was for, and she let the moment be fully what it was without diminishing it by speaking. After Delphine left, driving carefully down the dark track with the textile secured on the seat beside her, Marguerite climbed the stairs and locked the vault and went outside. She walked to the end of the dock and stood above the water. The lake was still. The willows along the eastern bank had gone fully gold, and some of their leaves were already on the surface, spinning in the slow circular pattern of things released. The sky had that particular depth that comes only on clear autumn evenings when the light is entirely gone, but the dark has not yet made itself at home. Marguerite stood there for a long time. She thought about Aldous Meriwether carving two words into the stone above a door in 1931, beginning something whose full dimensions he could not have imagined and whose consequences would not be finished for nearly a century. She thought about a man named Samuel Adler walking back out into the dark in November of 1938, having left behind the only thing of rose he could make safe. She thought about David Adler sitting at her kitchen table in February, holding a ring in a closed fist, not yet ready to look at it. She thought about Delphine Fairbanks pressing both hands over her mouth at the moment a thing kept for 78 years was finally named. She thought about Barnaby. She thought about what it meant to do right in silence over years without anyone watching, without any expectation of being known for it. She thought about what it meant to trust someone enough to build something for them over 37 years and then point them toward it with a direction and a drawer number and the confidence that they would understand what it required. She thought about Clement Prescott telling her what Barnaby had said at their last meeting. I hope I have not waited too long to give Marguerite what she is owed. She thought about what it meant to be a man who spent his final weeks worrying not about himself, but about whether his love had arrived in time. Mortimer had tried to erase her. He had given her instead the one thing he could not have understood the value of because the value was not in the money or the legal standing or the victory over his attempt to take what was not his. The value was in this, the work, the 41 names becoming fewer, the vault doors opening for people who had stopped believing there was anything left to open. The particular look on a face when something lost across a generation is returned by a stranger who kept a promise they never made but chose to honor. That was what Barnaby had handed her. That was what she had been aimed toward all along. She was 82 years old, standing on a dock above a dark lake in September, and she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was built to do, with the knowledge that the man who had known this about her before she had known it herself had also known with the same certainty that it was not too late. It was not too late. The water held the last of the light. The willows breathed. Behind her, Meriwether Station stood in its clearing, with its pale stone and its lit windows and its vault below, a room full of kept promises waiting for the next name on the list to be found, the next door to open, the next moment of return. Marguerite turned around and went back inside. There was still work to do. There always would be, and that she understood now was not a burden. It was the whole point. It was the thing Barnaby had trusted her with, and she intended to carry it for as long as she was able in the same way he had carried it before her quietly, completely, and without ever needing anyone to watch.